Hello my lovelies and welcome to cycle 1 of our Sketchbook Club theme, the Song of Spring. I am absolutely beaming ear to ear to be here with you for another beautiful season of mindful creativity inspired by this beautiful new season. Now I have to say I think the spring season is one of my favourite seasons, where sort of all around us in nature, the world is waking up. There's such a sense of potential. Birds are singing the loudest they have done for the whole year, singing out their territory. And we're making nests and we're sort of getting ready, sorting our nests out at home even and getting ready for the sort of spring and the summer and the lighter days ahead. So it's a beautiful time filled with potential. And I'm really excited to get stuck into this first session of our Sketchbook Club classes together. So it's very simple materials for the first cycle. You'll just need an egg, and there's lots of images of eggs on the resources, so don't worry if you've not got any eggs in the fridge. You'll need a soft pencil for the first part, the tuning in exercise. You'll need some drawing inks, a brush, some watercolour paper, and if you have them, then we're going to start to work with our spring season colours today. So there's an option on the resources for you to do a little spring mixing chart using these 4 colours, but these 4 colours have been hand selected carefully by our tutors to complement your work on the spring season. If you don't have this little set of colours, please don't worry. I offer alternatives of sort of basic colours that you might have in your palette already that you can work with for the colour aspect of this first cycle. And I'm grinning ear to ear because I'm just so excited. I'm so happy that you're here with us. And I'm really looking forward to this journey over the next few weeks. We're keeping things super simple, super gentle for this first cycle. Everything is very beginner friendly, so if you're just joining us for the first time, please don't worry. We really break things down, we really make them simple for you. So I think whatever level you're at, you're going to really enjoy this first tutorial of the cycle. And as always, do have a look on the resources, have a look on the Pinterest board that our lovely Janice has put together for you too. And you'll find loads and loads of extra inspiration on there to get you going with this first cycle of the project. So I'm not going to waffle on too much more because I'm really keen to get going with you today. But it's a fun one, that's all I'll say. And I'm really looking forward to getting started with this project for you. I've been aching to get started on this project with you. So let's go. Okay, my lovelies, let's get started on our spring season. You can see my sketchbook is really full as we come full cycle into spring. So let me just find a page we can work on. Here we go. So all you're going to need for these little tuning in exercises is a 2B pencil, and if you've got a graphite stick, great. If you don't worry. And then some kind of a blender. So I've got a little tortie on here. It's just a little rolled up piece of paper that acts as a blender. But if you don't have a blender, you can just use some paper towel. So make sure you've got a little bit of paper towel to hand. So to kick off this season, we're going to be looking at eggs. And I've just got some eggs from my fridge here. So the beginning of the spring season, we're going to look at eggs and we're going to do some studies, some drawings of eggs. I have really fond memories of eggs. When I was growing up, I had a little chicken called Pecky, and she used to lay these little speckledy eggs. And in fact, these lovely little eggs that I've picked up from the farm shop have got some lovely little speckledy tones to them. So funnily enough, we've been drawing eggs over on my Learn to Draw course because they are a really fantastic sort of place to start in terms of understanding shape and tone. So I'm going to put my little egg just in the middle of my page here so you can see him. And we're going to start by just doing some really loose ellipses. So just a 2B pencil. And we're going to sort of see if we can find that inside shape. So 2B pencil sort of on its side, palm down on the page, and we're just going to create some little elliptical shapes. So we're sort of using ellipses to find that inside shape of the egg. So you use the ellipses just to sort of measure that inside shape. And then once you've got a sort of a few ellipses, it's just a way of sort of loosening up, then you sort of bring your line down either side. So we're sort of just trying to find that inside space of the egg before we start. Now, all eggs are different. So in a way, they're quite forgiving, but they tend to sort of move towards a point at the top, and then they sort of get wider, and then they come down towards a sort of shallow base. So they end up looking a little bit pointy at the top. But if you look at a real egg compared to a sort of symbolic version of an egg, they're a lot less pointy. So get yourself an egg from the fridge so you can sort of draw from observation here. And we're just warming up with some really light little sort of circular shapes, which we can then build our main outside line around. And this sort of way of sketching is an awful lot looser than sort of trying to do this. Although you can have a go at this as well if you want to have a go at just finding the whole loose egg shape. But the idea behind ellipses is they're sort of measuring the inside space of an object, especially a curved object. So if you get sort of used to sketching these light little ellipses, you may find it easier to find the overall shape of the egg. So I'm going to leave it up to you sort of how you approach your sketching, either just a series of little ellipses measuring the inside space of the egg and then connecting sort of top to bottom. You can probably work from the wrist here if I'm honest, and keeping your sketching nice and light and loose until you find the shape that you're happy with. Or alternatively, just sort of scribbling out some eggs onto your page or some loose sort of egg shapes. The whole idea here is just to tune into the shape, to sort of notice any fallout between what we think the egg looks like, I'll do another one here, and what it actually looks like, and to sort of get used to finding these sort of oval shapes. So you can do a load of little scribbledy eggs over your page and just sort of warm up in that way. Just to remember, sort of, if you hold your pencil about halfway down, it will sort of relax into a sort of heel of your hand here, I suppose, or so this little kind of gap between the fingers. So it's sort of sitting at an angle, and what that helps you do is to sort of keep your sketching nice and light. If you're working here, you'll be working from the wrist, and that's a lot tighter, and you can't sort of make such large shapes. If you work from the sort of halfway down, notice how my wrist isn't moving at all. It's fixed, and it's my elbow and shoulder that are moving to create that light sketchy movement. So just sketch, have a bit of fun with it, see if you can find those egg shapes, which, you know, is something we're really familiar with, an egg, full of potential, of course, and a really nice way to get started on this theme, just looking at eggs. So just a little scribbly, loose, tuning in exercise, you know, 4 or 5 minutes of just finding those egg shapes on the page, just sketching really lightly and loosely with a 2B pencil, because it's going to be, or a 3B pencil, something nice and soft. Beauty of a 2B or a 3B is that if you then want to remove the marks, because I've worked so lightly, that'll just come away really easily. So that is your first little tuning in exercise of the spring season. Enjoy. So once you have filled your page with these little experiments, we're going to move on to adding a little bit of tone now. So, you know, when we draw sort of scratchy outlines like this, it doesn't tend to, you know, the sort of sketch tends to look quite flat, and that's because there's no light or shadow on the sketch. So we're going to look at some ways that we can create some light and shadow in your eggs. And if you look at my egg here, you'll notice that there's a highlight from the light that's coming in from the window. So you'll see a little highlight here, and then you'll see the light dissipating as it reaches the base of the egg. So this area is sort of darker than this area where the light is hitting. So imagine that this is the highlight. Well, don't imagine, notice this is the highlight, and then the light gradually sort of dissipates as we get towards the base of the egg here, which is a lot darker. So how can we capture that really nice and simply and mindfully? Well, my friends, there's a couple of different ways you can go about it. The first one that I'm going to show you is a scribbly egg. And again, this is something we do on our Learn to Draw course. It's a great little exercise. So I've got a graphite stick here. If you haven't got a graphite stick, then you can sort of get your pencil and just shave your pencil onto the page. I'll talk you through that in a minute. But with the graphite stick, it looks like this. So what we do is that same thing where we're sort of finding, oh, that's a bit small. I've gone a bit small. Finding that inside shape of the egg first, just by scribbling. Yeah, so just scribbling down some graphite onto the page. Don't need to overwork it at this stage. Just scribble, right? And then we've got that sort of inside shape of the egg already down on the page. And then just grab a bit of paper towel. And what we're going to do here is we're going to smudge. Very gently, we're going to blend that pencil that we've put down into the tooth of the paper. So as we do this, you'll notice your graphite getting a little bit darker, a lot softer, yeah? And as I'm sort of working, I'm sort of bringing out the shape in areas where I feel like it's missing as well, if that makes sense. So now we've got all the tone down, okay? So I can add a little bit more in, maybe on this side it's a little bit darker. Remember I was talking about those highlights, so I can add a little bit more in here. And then again, I'm going to blend towards the light area there. So this is the shadow area, and I'm going to blend towards the light. So I'm just very lightly rubbing that pencil into the tooth of the paper using paper, because that works really well. And again, if you've got a sort of blending tool, that will do the same thing. So it is just paper on paper, and you can sort of almost draw with that blending tool, which is really, really satisfying. But if you don't have one, you may have a pastel version of this. If you don't have one, then a paper towel does the job just as well. So can you see how that egg is sort of taking shape now? It's sort of coming to life. The eggs are not sort of made to be drawn with this heavy outline. They are pure tone. They are either light or shadow. So sort of try and find that inside shape rather than trying to carve out an outline. And you may find that really helps you if you find sort of drawing in proportion to be quite challenging. So now that we've got that, we can use a rubber to sort of re-establish, I'm getting a bit messy over here, re-establish the highlights or the light areas. So what I'm going to do is use my rubber, this is my kneadable eraser, and I'm going to just take out that highlight that I was talking to you about. And then I'm just going to sort of slowly but surely rub my rubber onto the surface in a sort of circular motion, sort of imagining how that light, not that egg, imagining how that light is sort of dissipating onto the egg, yeah? So it's a sort of push and pull process, this is what we call it, where you sort of take away a little bit, have a look, is that too strong, is that too sharp? You can also use the rubber to sort of reshape the edges of your egg, so if you've sort of lost a bit of the shape, it's looking a bit smudgy, you can just kind of carve in. So we're sort of a bit like a lot of the mindful activities we're doing, we're working in reverse here, putting all the tone down first and then lifting away to show the light. So now that I've removed a bit of light from the surface, I can go back in with my blender or my paper towel and sort of blend towards, so blend in the direction of that light and soften it off a little bit. Just going to blow, there we go, without losing all my feathers. And can you see that sort of graduation in the light there? And so then we can sort of, have a look and think about, you can see that my egg is sort of covered in light all across this top band. So I really want to honour that. I want to take away a little bit more graphite in those areas so that I can see that lovely little highlight. And then with the shadow areas, we just blend towards the light areas, and then it's pretty subtle stuff, really. So take away a tiny bit more here because it is a lot brighter on that bit of the highlight. And again, we're just blending in, softening in. Again, you can do this with your sort of pencil blender or your pastel blender, or just with your paper towel. It is just exactly the same. It's just a little bit chunkier, and you'll end up with a bit of graphite on here, which will really help. So now that I've sort of accentuated the highlight, I'm just going to go in and intensify the shadow. And that is my sort of working in reverse egg. So I can pop a little bit of shadow in here. Yeah. Just to sort of emphasize, and it's actually quite dark down here at the base of my egg as well. So it can look really messy when you're adding the tone. And then as you sort of blend off, I'll give you some nice pictures to work from in the resources for this as well. So you don't have to work from the egg that's sort of lying on my page. I just thought this was a nice, easy way for you to see exactly what I'm drawing as I'm doing it without breaking any eggs. So we're just blending those shadows towards the light areas so we get a nice subtle shift in light between that bottom darker corner and that top very light edge. So that's a really simple way to find an egg from the inside, just by putting down all the pencil, all the graphite first. If you haven't got a graphite stick, do the same thing, but with a pencil just on its side. Sort of try and find that inside shape first. And then come in with your paper towel and just blend, and it will do exactly the same thing. It's just that my graphite stick is a lot softer because it's a 6B, so it's a lot quicker to get that sort of depth of tone down. So always using your pencil, just do as I say, not as I do. Always use your pencil on the side like this, because then you just get nice soft tone on the surface. A bit out of control this morning because I'm quite excited, really excited to be back filming these lovely tutorials for you, and I've just been aching to get cracking on this spring season. So there we go, you can do exactly the same thing, side of the pencil, and then just blend with your paper towel, and look, you get actually a really lovely, quite subtle egg from that. It's almost there, isn't it? All we need to do is bring a bit of that tone around, and that's there. So I'm not going to go, this is not the Learn to Draw course, so I'm not going to go into the technicals too much of line and shadow, but do have a look at the resources, because I'll share some bits from Learn to Draw so that you can see sort of eggs and light and sort of understand what I was just talking about there, but visually. So the sort of source of the light, the highlight, and how the shadow sort of dissipates. And if you can draw an egg like this, you can pretty much draw anything. It just gives you a really good solid understanding of how light is cast on an object and how to render that using these sort of tonal techniques. So again, like I can use my rubber once I've found that inside space to sort of reshape my little egg. And actually, it's a lot more subtle if you use your pencil on its side. You get a much more subtle tone. And look at that lovely little highlight sort of sitting there. It's sort of slightly in the wrong place, but that's what we want. We want that sort of beautiful highlight with the soft tone around it. So, establish that, but in the area where it's meant to be, if that makes sense. So there we go, lovely little soft tonal eggs, just finding that inside space. And working from the inside out, which will help you to find the proportion, the shape of the egg a little bit more accurately, and it might just trick your mind into finding this task to be quite fun, quite enjoyable, rather than something that makes you want to run a mile. Eggs are just so beautiful, and we'll be doing a lot more egg studies over the course of this particular chapter, this beginning chapter of the spring season. Okay, so we've sketched some outlines of some eggs, we've learned a little bit about ellipses and sketching loosely, and we've found the inside shape of an egg just using a graphite stick or a pencil on the side and starting to look at sort of light and shadow. And again, it's this highlight, it's keeping some areas light that will bring it to life. It's that sort of showing how the light sort of wraps around the egg. If you can do that with your pencil, then your egg will sort of burst into life. I want to show you the other way of doing eggs two ways. I always feel like I'm in a restaurant doing these tutorials. But just because this technique will work for some people, and for other people that'll be really glitchy because your style is a little bit more tidy, a little bit more precise. So if you're not into this way of doing things, then use that technique which I showed you before. So either sort of using the ellipses and measuring that inside shape of the egg first, and then bringing those lines down either side using your pencil, just really lightly sketching until you find the shape that you're happy with. So you can go this way. And then once you've got the shape that you're happy with, really watch the bottoms of the eggs, so they're actually a lot flatter than we would imagine. Once you've got that shape, you can then get rid of those marks. And this is just an alternative way of doing exactly the same thing, because I like to give you options, and then you'll find the one that feels right for you. So try both, and then sort of helps you to identify what your style is as an artist, really. So there's my sort of loose egg shape. It's not perfectly anatomically correct, but I'm happy with it, it'll do. And then with this one, it's a little bit more laborious, but you get to the same result. So I've talked to you about the shadow being in this bottom left-hand corner because the light is coming from here. So essentially, the other way to do eggs is to start at the shadow. So start down there with your pencil, put some tone down, try and keep it nice and soft, try and avoid too many sort of marks. So that whole sort of base shadow down here, just holding our pencil on its side like that and just sort of scrubbing away at the page to get some tone down, or in other words, some pencil down on the page, okay? And you can go, if you want it a little bit stronger, yes, you can sort of use the end of your pencil just to intensify, but what we don't want is sort of harsh linear marks here. We want things nice and soft. And then it's exactly the same process. You grab your paper towel or your blender, and you're just going to blend towards the light area. So this is takes a bit longer because you're having to add all the tone. But for some people, this is going to feel, they're going to feel more in control by doing the things this way. So I wanted to offer up both options because I know we all have our own different styles, our own different ways of working. So you keep adding tone or shadow in effect to that bottom corner, and then you just keep sort of rubbing with your paper towel and blending towards the light area. Yeah, so you may have to go at this several times, and what you end up is just a much more subtly toned egg, I suppose. So the reason why I like to sort of skip to my graphite stick is because it's a lot deeper and darker, and I can sort of add tone a lot quicker, for my mind moves fairly fast, hence needing to do these lovely calming slow down tasks. But you can see there I'm just getting more graphite down on the page, and I can sort of blend towards that top area, and my egg is pretty much there. He's not far off. Now if you want to, you can add a little bit of shadow to the base, and if you sort of move your pencil side to side, especially if you've got a pencil, say like this, if you move your sort of pencil side to side, that's going to suggest to the eye that this area is flat. So completely different process to when we're working the tone. We're working in a circular direction, but if you want to show flatness, side to side marks. And again, you can blend this. So say you've got your egg up or sitting up in an egg cup, you may want to add a little bit of shadow tone. And again, then it's just about sort of strengthening this bottom corner. So this way of working, sort of adding tone into a sort of empty egg shape, I suppose, for want of a better technical way of describing it, is a little bit more sort of painstaking. It's not as quick as sort of filling the space with graphite and then removing. But again, for some people, this will suit their style more. And you do, in that way, you can really preserve the light areas, the highlight areas. And again, you know, you can reshape the shape of your egg still using your rubber. That's a really nice thing to do. And it's sort of tidy up the drawing once you've got the tone down. And you'll notice really, you know, this is not a place for a hard line. Not a place for a hard line in this edge really. It's just the light or shadow on the egg will give you the overall shape of the egg. So it takes a bit more work this way, but it's sort of a bit more controlled, I suppose, which some people may really enjoy. So that's eggs two ways this morning, just playing around with softening pencil to create a lovely subtle little value study, as I'd call it, a sort of study of light and shadow, just using the egg as our subject, as we will be doing for the whole of this episode, which is going to be really good fun. So there we go, egg two ways. And then if you do have any sort of marks on the eggs, this is not a speckledy egg a la my little chicken, but if you do want to add little marks, if you have got some pigmentation on your egg, that's just the next very subtle layer. So if you just sort of dibble, sort of just wiggle on the surface, or even, with the very end of your pencil, if you want really tiny dotting, you can add in some little areas of pigmentation there. And then what I would do with that, instead of leaving it sort of as is I would soften it a bit. So I soften it a bit with my blender, just a little wiggle, and that just creates much more subtle tones. So you don't end up with an egg that looks sort of super spotty. And actually with your, if you have got a tortillon, what's left on the end of the tortillon or the blender there is just graphite. So you can actually do some really subtle mark making just using the graphite that's sort of left over on the end of your blender. So if you've got a blender, use that. But if you don't worry. You can do the same thing just by popping pencil down and then softening it off a little bit with a paper towel or with a blender if you've got one. And there we have a little speckledy egg. Isn't that satisfying? So that's it for our sort of intro exercises. And in the next part of this episode, we're going to be doing some inky eggs. So get your watercolour paper out. You may want to try out the watercolour paper that you got in the starter kit, or any old sort of 300 GSM watercolour paper will work for that. And then you'll just need some drawing inks, and I'll talk you through the different inks that we'll use in the next part of this chapter. So I'm very excited for the next stage of this with you. Okay, my loves, are you ready to get a little bit inky? I've been aching to share this with you. Now, some of you may have caught my inky eggs tutorial that I did for Cupsmith, but I'm going to revisit it here because this is the foundation for doing some slightly different inky eggs with some slightly different colours. But we're going to start off just with some drawing inks. So I've got the burnt sienna and the burnt umber that we were working with through the autumn term. You can also use your oak gall ink. If you've still got oak gall ink from the autumn term, that'll work well, although it's very punchy, don't forget that. So the nice thing about these sort of natural drawing inks is that they're natural, that they've got natural colours, and the colours, the burnt umber and the burnt sienna, really echo the colours of just your regular egg that you'd pick up from the farm shop. I hope you do get your eggs from the farm shop these days. And then I've also got a bit experimental, talking about my friends Cupsmith. You know that you got in your subscription box some tea, some breakfast tea, and I took some of their breakfast tea and I've made my own ink out of it. So this is my tea ink and this is their breakfast coffee, which I've also made into an ink, and I'm going to supply in the resources a little recipe if you'd like to have a go at that, but it's really simple. You just let sort of your tea bag sort of soak into some water. It releases its tannins, the same as when we made our oak gall ink, and then you just boil that down a little bit, add some gum arabic, and you've got yourself a homemade ink. And I'm aching to show these to you. So we'll start off. I've just got a size 12 sea white, Kolinsky sable brush. These are those sable brushes we sell in the shop, and this is my absolute favourite brush at the moment. It's a lovely round edged brush, and it's really great for these kind of shapes, these soft organic shapes. So all we're going to do is take some water and we're going to create a little water mask. Okay, so that is just straight onto the watercolour paper. Just going to pull some water down, and we're going to find that egg shape from the inside, hence those tuning in exercises, looking at the inside space, the inside shape of the egg. Now, I don't expect you to be an expert. Sorry, I've been making egg jokes all day. I don't expect you to be an expert at the egg shape straight away, but that's why we're practicing with these little water masks right now. So pop down your water mask, try not to be too fussy. You don't want it to be too wet. So if it's really pooling with water, just dry your brush off and you can lift out a little bit of the water. So we want it damp but not soaking wet, okay? And you'll get better at this as we go along, so don't worry if it doesn't all work straight away. And then I'm going to dip into my burnt sienna ink and I'm just going to drop it into this bottom left-hand corner. So I'm just dropping it in. I'm trying not to mess with it too much, letting it find its way gently around the edge of that egg shape that I've created. If it's not moving much, because I just removed a load of water, you can add a little bit of water to help it move. Now the idea behind this, as I said, is to be mindful. So we drop it in just on one side, and the reason why we're doing that is because we want to try and preserve the highlight on the egg. So that little key highlight where the light sort of hits the surface of the egg. So we don't want to muck with it too much. So I'm going to leave that one like that, just encourage it across a little bit more just with some water. And I'm just going to let that one dry. And whilst that's drying, I can move on to my next one. So this is a really great chance to be experimental. So to try out whatever inks you might have in your sort of art supply materials. And I'm going to show you what a few different ones look like. So I'm just doing another water mask, and we're going to fill this whole little sort of half page. It's not quite A4. It's like 1/8 imperial or something like that. Don't ask me why. So this one I'm going to go for burnt umber, just so you can see the difference between the burnt sienna and the burnt umber. That's moving really nicely. So you sort of get used to how much water to put down as you go. And again, we don't want to over egg the custard here. So just pop a little bit in that sort of shadow area. And then if you want to sort of clean your brush, you can encourage it to sort of soften and split as it moves across. But don't add too much water because you'll lose all that lovely pigment, okay? So that is about right. Don't worry about rough edges and things like that for now. We're not even thinking about those. We're just finding the shapes and dropping some ink in and seeing what it does. So let's do that again. Another little egg shape. And as I said, this is a great chance to practice getting familiar with that egg shape. Finding my ink pot slightly getting in the way here. If you feel like you're a bit restricted, especially on that outside curve, just turn your page a little bit, okay? It will help you get round the corner because our wrists have a sort of limited movement, and you get the most control actually on this inner arc. So just noticing that. You may find it a bit more challenging to do the opposite side, in which case just turn the whole page around. Okay, I'm going to go in for some coffee ink this time because I love the subtlety of this ink. So just pulling out any extra little bits, get my coffee ink, and I'm going to drop that in exactly the same way. And look, the tone is so much more subtle on the coffee ink, almost sort of invisible in that first layer, but that's great because eggs are quite subtly coloured, aren't they? So just popping it in, it's a much lighter pigment, and just letting it move and spread as usual, leaving a little bit of space for that highlight. And that guy's done, I'm just going to leave him. So I'm going to keep working my way across the page now, just adding little eggy shapes. Big or small, you can do them upside down. You can have a bit of fun with this and create like a little pattern with your eggs. A little army of eggs brimming with potential. So this one I'm going to try my tea ink because I actually haven't tested this one yet. The road testing my tea ink. Again, it's a nice warm tone. Don't have to be so careful with this tea ink because it's so subtle, but look at that colour that we're getting from that lovely breakfast tea. So we sent you a couple of tea bags in your subscription boxes. You know, drink one and ink one if you like. Use one to create some inks for yourself that you can use this season. Actually, that tea ink is by far my favourite. Isn't that the irony of things sometimes? So again, I'm just going to continue across the page and I'm going to fill my page with these little inky experiments, put this first layer down. So I'm going to do that now, but I'm going to speed it up for you because it's more fun if we do things a bit faster. Or it's more fun for you to sort of watch the process, in fact, I think. And I'll just go through, I'll use some oak gall ink as well. So you've got an example of lots of different types of ink and how the ink sort of performs when you drop it into that water mask. So let's do this. Okay, so I just wanted to say, I hope you enjoyed watching me doing my little inky eggs there. You can see there the oak gall, what I was talking about it being really punchy, because it's really tannin heavy, this old sort of medieval ink. It can be quite difficult to work subtly with it, but look at some of these guys as they're drying. Look at those lovely sort of highlights we're getting. So it's all about being super subtle here. It's not about over-egging it in terms of your materials. And I don't know if you watch me fiddling around with these guys here, but my recommendation is once you've put down your water mask, don't fiddle with the shape because you'll get really fussy, and we can change the shape if we need to later on. Just make that shape, go with it, and you'll see as the ink dries that it will start to look more egg-like. So whilst my egg is drying, of course I'm going to go and make myself a nice cup of tea now. I recommend that you do the same, let it dry all the way down, and then I'm going to show you a really subtle way of working over the top of it as well. So lovely gentle start to the spring season, taking things nice and gently, nice and mindfully, and I find this process so exciting, so I hope you do too. So, cup of tea made and actually half slurped. I got carried away drinking my tea. But these have dried down so beautifully. It really is a case of less is more when it comes to dropping the ink in. And yeah, as they've dried, they've got a bit messy around the edges, and I'm sort of all right with that, you know. That's sort of just as the paper sort of interacts with the ink, sometimes it splits into other areas. So we're going to do a little tidy up job first and add another layer of ink now just to bring these to life, and then I'm going to show you some little things you can do just to finish them off. So we're starting off just with these neutral tones, and then we're going to move into using some of your lovely spring colours, and I'll talk to you about those in the next part of this tutorial. So let's make a little bit of space. I'm just going to move my water up. If you haven't changed your water yet, this might be a good time to do it. So I'm just going to shift my inks over a little bit. Such a Virgo, the way I line things up. And I'm going to wet my brush. And what I'm going to do is just sort of give these a little tidy up now before they're completely and utterly dry. So this might involve, first of all, moving my egg. I might pop that back in the fridge. And just sort of shifting the paper around a little bit so you can get that little arc that I was talking about. So I've just got water on my brush now. And I'm just going to have a little rub at these and see if I can get them to soften off a little bit. Yeah, perfect. And you can see on this one, do they remind you, did I say this? Do they remind you of the phases of the moon? Because they do me, because they're sort of dark on one side and then light on the other. So we're going to just sort of even them out a little bit here, but we want to be really mindful to keep that highlight because that's really what's going to make them look 3D. So this one, I'm just coming in with my brush and I'm going to wet it again. Making sure you can see what I'm doing, and just sort of with water and with a really delicate brush like this sable brush, you can just sort of soften off any hard edges where the ink will have pooled into a corner, and then just encourage that ink to come around to create the rest of the shape. And you know, if you've got any really heavy sort of pigment sort of lying there, then you can give it a little bit of a scrub too. There's an amazing amount of blending that you can do with inks or with watercolours, just with a little bit of water on your brush. So again, we want to keep that nice highlight. We don't want to lose it too much. So I'm not going to overwork this. But whilst that's still a little bit damp, I'm just going to take a little bit more of the burnt sienna and I'm going to drop it into that bottom corner just so I get a nice crisp edge this time round. So yeah, working with wet on wet, as the sort of ink dries and as the water dries, you will get some little sort of tougher edges. So it's just a chance to just tweak that a little tiny bit, but without overworking it. So just finding that egg shape again. And if you want to, whilst it's still quite damp just from the brush, you can drop in a little bit of extra pigment into that bottom left hand corner. That will sort of again give it a nice defined edge. So that's about all I'm going to do for that egg. And actually he's looking so much better just from that little tidy up job. So from here you can just add again another layer. So if I wet down this area that's a bit darker, that's going to soften it off, and I can chuck, just drying my brush off a little bit before I do that, because you want to be careful not to lose that lovely work that you've already created. And if you chuck too much water over the top,
you will just push that ink away, which we don't really want to do. So we're going to drop a little bit more into there because that water has sort of had an impact. And if you want sort of soft pigmentation, then this is the way to go about it. Wet an area, get a little bit of ink on the end of your brush and just drop it in whilst it's still a little bit damp. And you can get some really nice textures on the surface of your egg there. That one, I'm literally going to leave it like that. This is all about simple pared back learning this time round. So this is my burnt umber, and you can see a really nice strong edge there, which I'm just going to come in again and soften ever so slightly. I don't want to lose that really lovely edge that I've created there. I just want to sort of curve off any areas where my egg wasn't quite the right shape. Again, I'll turn it round because it gives me a little bit more control and get a little bit of burnt umber, which is what I was working with originally. And I'm just going to go straight in with that on the bottom of the ink just to find that shape. So that's going in now. Lovely jubbly. Lovely jubbly. I don't know why I'm saying lovely jubbly. I'm in a really joyful mood today. I have been awaiting this moment with great anticipation, being able to sit down and start filming for spring, because we've had these ideas rattling around in our minds for the last month or so. So there you can see I've got a really strong edge of burnt umber. I don't want it quite that strong, so now just with a wet brush, I'm just going to blend it. Just be really careful. My big brush does pick up a lot of water, these watercolour brushes do. So with that wet brush, I'm just going to blend towards the light areas just with water, okay? And again, I don't want to add too much. I want to keep that sort of looseness that I found in that first layer. That is enough, no more than that, okay? Now with things like your tea and coffee ink, you're getting some quite subtle tones anyway. Look at that little crack from where the sort of ink has dried. That's quite nice. We could just keep that there, yeah? So this is about being mindful, and it's about like understanding that actually overworking can sort of, you lose a lot of this beauty that's created through this wet on wet process if you overwork it. So for this one, I'm not going to wet it at all because I know it's already still quite damp. I'm just going to go in with my coffee ink and I'm just going to pop another little layer on there. This time I'm sort of dibbling. So instead of trying to create any sort of brushwork, I'm just adding some pigmentation essentially to my egg. And it's that interaction between that bottom layer, which is quite light, and then adding a second layer. Each time you add a layer, your pigment or your ink will appear a little bit darker. So I'm going to soften it off on that edge, and I'm just going to create some texture using the bottom of my brush, trying not to sort of cloud out that lovely sort of light that I've got coming through. I really like that one. I'm really enamoured by these tea and coffee inks. They are so subtle. And here's my tea ink, which you can see it hasn't quite finished drying there yet. And I don't want to mess with that at all because it's a really lovely little shadow. So all I'm going to do is get my water again. And I'm just be really careful not to stick your hand in your existing eggs. I've just stuck my hand in my coffee ink egg there. So see this line here? I'm just going to soften that off with a tiny bit of water. Okay, so I'm just going to, just because I don't really want that watermark sitting down the middle of my egg. And then I'm going to add a tiny, tiny, tiny little bit more of that tea ink in. And this guy is just going to be super subtle, which is the subtlety that you get from this tea ink is just fantastic. Literally just made with that breakfast tea that I put in your subscription boxes. And it is really, really simple to do. It's something that we're getting really into over here at Surrey Art School. It's making our own inks. And in fact, as we move into bringing our sketchbook club, our print club back to life online, that's one of the things we're looking at, is how can we use natural pigments to make some printmaking inks. I don't know about you, but that idea really excites me. So berry inks, walnut ink, all those kind of wonderful natural materials. So that's it for my tea ink one. I'm just going to leave him exactly as he is because I know that when that dries, that's going to create a really beautiful shadow line. Aren't they beautiful already? They're so simple, but they're so beautiful. Okay, so something a bit different now. This is my burnt umber egg. just softening off his edges like I did with the other ones, being careful not to remove too much of the pigment as I go, really watching out for that little tea ink experiment because I want him to stay as he is. And again, like I did in the last one, just sort of bringing the water back around to make that full shape of the egg. Yeah, and you can sort of soften again, super subtle work this, just softening with your brush. You can't go too far wrong with this. I'm not going to add any extra pigment on top of that egg because I really like the subtlety of it. So I'm going to leave that one, and then what I'll do is I'll add a splatter to it, and I'll show you the splatting in a minute. So all your eggs are going to be different. All of them are going to have dried slightly differently. All the inks are going to have behaved differently with this process. And that's really good because it's sort of getting to know your inks for the later stages of this project as well. You know, we're going to use a lot of ink during this project. This week, eggs. Next week, nests. Very excited about that. Had this beautiful little nest donated to me by the lovely Nikki, our queen of admin here. Absolute essential component of Surrey Art School because she keeps my weirdness contained. So just keep working. I don't know why I'm telling you that, but it is true. She sort of keeps me on the straight and narrow. Every creative needs someone grounded to sort of work and walk alongside them. So you can sort of soften them off. You can play around with adding new layers. I think this is a coffee ink again here. So I could just go over the top and, you know, really subtly tone that coffee ink and just sort of, you know, add that extra layer and that will start to pop. But what I did want to show you as a little finishing touch, something that we found super satisfying here, is just a bit of splatting. So if you've got whatever inks you've got, I'm hoping you've got a couple of different tones, but you can start to mix these up and play around with them a little bit now. So for example, with my burnt sienna egg, I could just spray a little bit of burnt umber over the top, and that's a really nice complementary tone for the burnt sienna, just a little bit darker. Now, hopefully, try not to make this too loud. If you want to splat, you do need to mask off areas, okay? So, as in, if you don't want to have splats all over your page, just get a bit of paper towel and just pop it sort of above your egg, and it'll just stop the ink from going absolutely everywhere. So I'm going to show you on this one, because it's nearly dry, how to now just add a little bit of a darker pigment of ink. This is the burnt umber, and I'm using one of my old synthetic brushes that I'm not too fussy about. I wouldn't splat with my sable because I love it too much and I don't want to destroy the shape. But a little bit of ink just onto my synthetic brush, and I'm just going to spray it with the slightly darker tone of ink. So it'll take a minute to get into the zone with this. Now, because my ink is a little bit dry, sorry, a little bit wet, that's going to really soften into the surface of the little painted egg. So you get a really subtle tone. So if you want really subtle pigmentation or subtle splats, then, you know, wet your egg down first very, very lightly, and then you can splat over the top. Now, isn't that just lovely? Oh, I just think that's fantastic. It's the kind of things, I don't know, like, you know, when you're little, you look at something like an egg and you think how marvellous it is, and you have no idea how, I don't know, you could ever paint or draw it. And then here we are doing things that little me never imagined I could do, and I hope you feel the same. So let's do the same thing, but on a dry egg. I've got this guy down here. He's quite dry. I haven't added much pigment to him yet. I think that was a tea ink. And rather than mess with him, I'll just show you how we can splat straight over the top of him. So burnt umber again, but you could also use, you know, that's a coffee ink one, you could use a tea, or you could try the burnt sienna. You can play around. Oh, oh yeah, he's really splattered. Oh, that's really nice. So that was burnt umber on the coffee ink. That I find incredibly satisfying. Obviously, I've slightly over-egged it on my spray on this one, but you know, I can always go in with a brush and sort of soften off if I want to. Be careful about fussing too much though, because obviously you'll lose a lot. See, that's quite nice. It's sort of just working its way into the wet area of the egg. So, you know, you could do exactly the same thing just by dipping dipping your brush if you want to be a bit more controlled, and just spotting with the end of your brush using a slightly darker tone. So those of you that don't like to get super messy, but I have the feeling that most of you are going to really enjoy getting involved with this splatting process. It's just so much fun. So let's do a different one here. I've got my, I think it's coffee ink base, and I'm going to get some burnt sienna just to see what it looks like, and I'm going to splat that. Oh yeah. So it's a bit like in the winter when we were talking about sort of boundaries for creativity, you know, limiting your selection of ink colours and then just playing around with, you know, working one over the top of the other can be really effective. So there it is, another little speckledy egg. Now I just know, knowing you lot, I know this is going to bring you a lot of joy. First episode and I've already got really inky nail polish, so sorry about that. I was feeling quite excited about my spring nails, but it is worth it. That is a really subtle variation that you get, a nice little bit of subtle pigmentation. You can see this one where I've sprayed wet onto a wet surface. It's much softer, much more subtle. So play around with that, with the eggs that you've got available to you, you know, and you may even want to, if you do an oat gall one, just add a bit of white gouache, or just add another splat, just using, say if I just go back with my oat gall ink, which is over here out of shot, and I'll just put my paper towel. I know it's not very pretty, my paper towel, but it is very useful for sort of containing the spread. I could just splat that with just another layer of oat gall ink, and that just perfectly complements what's already happening underneath on the surface, and we're getting some really subtle layers here. What's nice about this exercise for the beginning of the spring term is it's simple and it's satisfying. So it's just all about easing you into this spring season by wetting down your paper, dropping in that ink, letting it dry completely, and then just adding a little finishing touch, whether it be a little bit more pigment or just layering pigments over the top of each other like I've done with this one here, or perhaps adding that little spray to your eggs so that they look a little bit more 3D, a little bit more authentic to the eggs that we might see in the farm shop or in little nests around the country over the next few weeks. There we go. Okay, folks, well, I can barely believe it, but this is the last chapter of this first cycle of our spring season. It's amazing, isn't it, when things just come together? Feels like they're meant to be. So I wanted to talk to you quickly about the colours that we sent out with your subscription kits. Don't worry if you didn't get these colours in the post, if you didn't do the subscription box option, that is totally fine, but I wanted to talk you through the ones that we chose. So myself and the tutors have picked 4 colours which we think will be really useful for you for this whole project. And we've sent you out a little sample in the post because we wanted you to have a chance to try them out and see if you like them. And then we've got some options on the shop to buy smaller tubes this term, which might actually, you know, be a little bit more reasonable for you, because we know that the Daniel Smith Artist watercolours are not cheap. But we also know they're absolutely fantastic. I think we've established that over the last few seasons, and we're going to be continuing to work with them. So this is a nice chance to try them, I suppose. We've also sent you some lovely rough Bockingford watercolour paper. So we normally work with a fairly smooth version of the watercolour paper, still 300 GSM, so nice and thick, and still cold pressed because it's much easier to work with. But we've sent you some rough examples of this rough stuff because we've really enjoyed working with this as well. You can see this little sample that Jackie has made for me, and that's on a lovely rough watercolour paper. So you might want to try out some of your paints onto one of those smaller samples to begin with, so you get an idea of the colours. But essentially you've got here undersea green, verditer blue, burnt tiger's eye, which is a really lovely little sort of textural sort of brown, but also is going to be really useful later on in the season when we start looking at nests lights and feathers, etc. Now I would save your larger sheet of the rough paper for later in the season, but your small sheet, you could use this just to sort of test out the colours that you've got. It's really important to understand how the colours look on paper, not just because they don't look the same when they're dry like this. So I'm going to pop my little sample of those to one side and invite you to, you know, be a bit more playful now as we move into colour and to try out some of those colours on this little exercise. So I've got those colours. I've also got a little bit of Brusho because I thought that would be quite fun. And then I've got my little tiny, tiny brush that we sent you out in the subscription box as well. So I'll use that for the delicate details of this little exercise today. Now, it is completely up to you how you go about sort of creating your egg base. You could, if you wanted to, use the same process that we just used for the inky eggs, which is to wet down with your brush first, drop the paint in, let it split, let it spread, let it dry, and then work another colour over the top. I'm going to show you the alternative version, which is to put down a wash. And again, if you feel safer or more comfortable, you could just get your pencil to begin with, going back to those sort of earlier exercises, and sort of sketch yourself a sort of egg outline. I am also not averse, if you're really struggling with that egg shape, to you tracing down the outline shape of the egg before you begin. But I'm going to sketch it because I can, and I know you can as well. But I'm just giving you that option in case you're still feeling a bit like, whoa, about all of this, and you want someone to tell you it's okay to use tracing paper if you're not feeling comfortable with creating that egg shape yourself. Here is me saying that is more than okay. So all I'm going to do for this first one is scribble all over my page. I've just sketched out a nice little egg shape there. And I'm going to put a wash down first, okay? So I'm going to use this blue to put down a wash, just using my bigger brush, adding a little bit of water to that blue, and then just putting that down as a base. So a wash should be nice and thin. You don't want it too thick at this stage. It's about building up the layers to create a nice punchy finish. You want some white from that page coming through. We talked about the light, didn't we, in the last exercise? So you want to keep some of that light. So that's my little base. Rather cute. I think it's rather cute. And then we'll have a go at doing some shapes with some of the other colours as well. So I'm going to go for an undersea green wash for this next one. And this one, I am just going to go for it and just paint it. I'm just going to go for it. So I'm going to paint the outline of my little egg. It doesn't have to be too little. In fact, the bigger you do them, the more you can sort of fit in here. Now that's a very pale wash. So I will add a little bit more of pigment to that, just sort of dropping it in wet on wet for this one. So there's two, you know, there's always more than one way, more than one approach. And again, I'm sticking to that sort of formula of just loading up the left-hand side and leaving a little bit of light coming through on the right. And this Daniel Smith paint really just loves to split and spread. So it's perfect for wet on wet watercolour. Really, really love wet on wet watercolour because it's just so calming, just to watch, a little bit like the inks, that paint just sort of spread. Okay, so we'll sketch this next one. So we're working our way through these spring colours. If you haven't got these colours at home, you just need like a sap green, you need a lemony yellow, you need a nice light blue, a cerulean blue would probably do. And you'll need, what else we got? Yellow, blue, green, and then a brown. So like a burnt umber will definitely do the trick. There's something about just sketching these freehand that is making my brain hurt a little bit today. So if you're feeling like that, that is okay. Well, just with sketching, what I do is I just do as many lines as I need until I get the one that I'm happy with. And then after that, I just go in and take away the other lines. So just remember with sketching that it doesn't have to be a perfect outline straight away. As you're sort of moving your hand around, I'm going to get rid of that one because it's a doof. As you're moving your hand around, you're sort of feeling your way into that shape, okay? So keep it nice and light, keep it nice and loose, and you can always adapt that shape a little bit. So I want my egg to be a little bit wider at the base, I can do that. See what I mean? How you sort of find the shape just by working loosely and lightly and not putting too much pressure on yourself, and you'll get something that looks egg-like. We're not looking for anatomically perfect eggs today. We're looking for sort of almost imaginary eggs, I suppose, in a way, although you'll find lots of images of eggs on the resources and also on that beautiful Pinterest page that the lovely Janice has created for us. So lots of inspiration there. Okay, so burnt tiger's eye now. This is that lovely, lovely browny tone, which reminds me a lot actually of those lovely tones we were using with the inky eggs. So very, very similar to that. I'm going to make sure I've got a little bit of paper towel in my hand always to get rid of any excess water on my brush. Just dibble into that a little bit and then we're going to drop that in. So it's quite subtle, the burnt tiger's eye, but it's got really nice sort of granulation on it. So I'm just going to pop that one straight in. To be honest, you probably got your egg on the first layer really with the burnt tiger's eye because it's the right colour. It's the right tone for the job. Actually going to be excellent for things like twigs as we move into nests in our next cycle. So look how that's just sort of spotted in there and then it sort of just sits really nicely. So that's a really subtle, very natural toned egg. Now let's go for something a little bit crazier, shall we? So now I'm going to go for my Hansa yellow. It's a really bright lemony yellow. We thought this was perfect for things like little spring bird beaks and, you know, there's little highlights. I suppose it matches my nail polish, so that brings me joy. So just popping in a base there, just a thin wash of that Hansa yellow, and then we'll decide what we're going to do with it. Great. So the nice thing about having multiple eggs on the go is that you can leave one to dry whilst you're working on the other one. So this little Viridian blue one, or is it Viridian? It's Vertiver blue, beg your pardon. Verditer blue even, blimey, third time lucky. So we're just going to add a little bit of shadow tone to the egg now. So I'm just going to wet down just that left-hand side, a bit like we did on the last experiments. Careful not to add too much water because you'll actually remove your wash. Note to self, she says. I'm going to go back with slightly stronger, so I'm going to really scrub that paint now as I drop this blue in to create that shadow tone. Oh, I don't know what it is about this blue, but I really love it. It's a real sort of spring blue, isn't it? After the cool, very cold colours of winter, it's ever so satisfying to work with something a little bit brighter. And we were really sort of careful not to bring too much colour into the winter, just very soft, hazy colours and light. But now we're in spring. Well, we can do our own thing, darlings. That's all I'm saying. We can go a bit wilder, a bit brighter. So see how that wash, that blue wash, that thin blue wash underneath is sitting beautifully underneath now because it's dry. And I'm able to just drop in that extra shadow tone, wet on wet, still preserving my highlight on the egg. It's really tempting to get carried away with this, but try not to, yeah? Less is more. And then we're going to add a little bit of speckle to this egg whilst it's still damp. So I'm just going to wet down the areas that I didn't put paint into. So everything is wet now on the surface of this egg. And again, if your pigment's a bit too strong, quite hard holding, I don't know why I'm hanging onto the paint the whole time. Dry your brush off. If it's gone a bit too strong, press and you can lift out some of that pigment. But it's that granulation, that crackle, which is perfect for the surface of the egg. And it almost looks like I'm looking through a window into like a beautiful blue sky. It's really very satisfying. In case you hadn't noticed, I'm full of the spring joys today. Okay, so this is just for a bit of fun. You don't have to do this, but on Jackie's suggestion, I'm going to chuck a bit of Brusho into this. I've got some burnt sienna Brusho. If you've never used Brusho before, it is basically a powder pigment. It's super strong. So delicate hand for this, please. And be careful it doesn't spill over the rest of your work. So there's my burnt sienna. It looks fairly sort of normal, quite boring, I suppose. But I'm going to put a bit in my hand. If I sprinkle that over my egg. Oh, Brusho is made for these wet on wet processes. I can add the pigmentation instead of sort of splatting, I can sprinkle. And that is just divine. And I think the reason why that works so well is because you've got a really lovely cool colour like the blue, and then you're chucking a warm tone over the top. So the burnt sienna is really warm. It's also really messy. It does dye your fingers. So if you are working with Brusho, my suggestion is that you make some holes in the top of your Brusho lid and sprinkle that way. But I've just done it with my hands because I don't mind getting my hands dirty. In fact, I quite enjoy it. So that's our first little experiment, just working with that Verdita blue and then chucking a warm tone of Brusho over the top of it. If it's a bit too strong, you can go in with your brush, but I really don't want to mess with that. I really like it as it is. I'll just show you. With a little bit of water on my brush, if I just press, I can soften it off a little bit. I can pick up little bits of pigment and I can dot my egg with different colours. But I don't want to mess with that too much because I like it as it is. This is very much a pared back season. We are thinking along the lines of, we are thinking less is more. We're going to keep things really simple for spring, keep things really beginner friendly, but as always, we're going to offer loads of options as to how you can sort of expand. Now, do be careful with your Brusho because you'll notice that my green egg has now got a little bit of warm tone in it, which I was just sort of semi-mindlessly sort of tidying up, and also so does my little yellow egg. So you've just got to be really careful with the Brusho. As soon as it hits water, it just goes boom. And because it's a dye, it's more of a dye than it is a paint, there's no going back with it. That's all I'm saying. If you play with it, you'll know what I mean. So I'm just going to go with another layer now. Just working with another layer of my green, I think. If you want to really intensify the shadow on this little greeny egg, you could get a little bit of blue. Ooh, and chuck that in. She says a little bit. I love to work with a big brush, but then sometimes it does some crazy stuff. So if you want to add a bit more shadow tone, that blue is going to blend really beautifully with the green because they're cool colours. So you'll end up with a sort of deeper hue of green. And then for the rest of that, I am just going to go in with some pure, slightly thicker green, and I'm going to chuck it in. See how that blue is so strong, it wants to push the green around. So I'm going to push it back with a bit of stronger green pigment. Now, if you are completely unfamiliar with watercolours, or if you want to get a better understanding of these core colours, you will find on the resources a little colour mixing sheet. We did this in the summer, and it's a really simple exercise. You just go through, mix the colours to different dilutions, mix them together and see what other new colours you can make. It's all really well explained on the resources, so don't just take my word for it. Have a look on the resources. But there's a downloadable sheet, or you can just use the framework from the sheet that's downloadable onto some watercolour paper to just do a very simple colour mixing exercise just with these 4 colours, or whatever 4 colours you've got at home if you haven't got the Daniel Smiths. We've been very generous with these. These are going to last you half the season, I think. So have a go at some colour mixing if you're really unfamiliar with these colours and how they sort of work and mix together. And that's a really useful exercise for any of us to do, really, just to get familiar with your spring palette, because we're going to work with these colours over and over again during the spring. So this won't be the first time. Isn't that sweet, that little leg, just with the sort of wet on wet dotted on? I'm not going to do anything else to that one. I just really like it as it is. It's just the green with green on top, and then a little bit of blue chucked into that bottom corner just to create the shadow. Good. So back to my burnt tiger's eye. That's already quite spotty. I'm just going to wet that one down again. Try not to lose all those lovely spots that I've created too much. Let's soften it off a little bit, pick out a few little areas. And I'm going to go back in with the burnt tiger's eye. I want this one to be really natural, super neutral. So back in with the burnt tiger's eye. Get it going first so it doesn't dilute too much, and you can just drop that in a little bit thicker this time. And again, that's going to granulate. It's going to give you a lovely texture on the surface of your egg. So that one is super simple. It's just burnt umber onto burnt umber with some burnt umber chucked in for good measure, okay? And then this last one, this little sorry, this little yellow egg. It'd help if I knew my colours, wouldn't it, sometimes, I think. This little yellow egg, you've got an option here. You can either sort of wet it down and you can chuck in some undersea green over the top. I think that would work really, really well. So you just, again, water mask the whole area and get rid of the extra water off your brush as always. It's really quite nice and subtle, that little yellow egg. I quite like him as he is. But I'm going to add a little hint of colour just using this undersea green. So I'm just going to pull that through that shadow area and soften it off with a bit of water. Sort of encourage it to merge with the colour that's underneath. And then we get this sort of lovely little two-tone egg going on. Now, if you don't want to sort of drop in wet on wet like that, this is looking a little bit like my other egg now, maybe because my wash wasn't quite as strong as I would have liked. But if you don't want to do that sort of subtle wet on wet work, well, there's also the option to chuck some brusho in there. So if you've got like an olive or a moss green, that would work really well, I think, for this. I've got a bit of olive here, so I can show you the same thing a la brusho. And again, it doesn't look anything like the colour that it creates. And drop a bit of olive in and see what it looks like. Woo! Wooey. What I love about brusho is the element of surprise. You never really know what it's going to do when it hits the surface, because you've got all these different pigments that make up the colour. They're all there in powder form. You'll be able to pick out all the colours that make up that olive green. So you'll see orange, you'll see like a turquoisey colour, you'll see some umbers in there. Really fun experimentation, the old brusho, but it's not for the faint-hearted. It's not subtle. It's pretty oomphy, but it does do some magical, incredible things. And I think that's why I love it, because I'm so enamoured with wet on wet watercolour anyway. Must really thank my friend Jane for introducing me to that process. But yeah, it's not subtle, it's pretty oomphy, okay? So the purpose of this exercise is to take a gentle step forward, okay? Moving from those lovely natural tonal eggs that we created just using the natural inks into playing around with some colour. But again, the boundary here is that we've given you these colours to work with, and you know, so mess around with combinations of those. Much like when we were doing the eggs, you could take, say, for example, that burnt tiger's eye, and you could, once this is all dried, you could flick it and create some lovely pigment over the top. Or, you know, you could lay a base with the Hansa Yellow Light as a wash, and then you could flick this undersea green over the top and create a much more subtle egg than I've created with my brusho there, yeah? So, or, last one, I promise. I'm always like, oh, you could do this, oh, you could do that. Or, last one, I promise, is you can take some of your eggs from the previous experiment, like these guys, and then you could take something like the burnt tiger's eye and you could splat that over the top of your inky eggs. So we're encouraging you to mix medias here. We're encouraging you to experiment. Yep, I said it, I've done it, I've said it. Experiment with the colours that we've given you, if you've got them, or with really similar colours if you can, that you may already have at home in your watercolour palette. They don't need to be these beautiful fancy Daniel Smith colours. It's completely up to you. If you've got just the basic colours in your palette, that will do the same job. So a lemon yellow, a sort of cerulean blue, a nice sap green, and a burnt umber will do exactly the same job for you. And I'm just going to finish by showing you this, okay? So I know that we are all at different levels. All on our own journey, all working at our own pace through this project, and that is exactly where we want you to be. We're not trying to pull you forward or out of your comfort zone too much. We're just trying to gently guide you as you move through your own journey. But I just wanted to show you this because I know that some of you will embrace the challenge of this. This is a classic Jackie Taylor study, and I absolutely love it. So instead of just having all your eggs in the row in a very Virgo way like I've done, Jackie has popped all these different eggs down, and she's sort of added some movement around the edge. She's even got some little fun feathers flowing through, and there's some really lovely ideas on there to create like a little egg-inspired sort of composition. And I love how she always sort of puts some text around the edge. We're really into our poetry here as inspiration, aren't we? We're really into sort of, you know, the whole picture of how we get inspired as artists, not just looking at other artists' work, but reading poetry, reading books, and bringing that into our learning as well. So this is a lovely little sample that Jackie's created. She is my queen sample maker. It's super inspiring to look at, and perhaps this will give you some ideas for where you take all these eggs that I've shown you and perhaps represent them if you want to. So this is a bit of an extension activity. You know, you are more than welcome just to work through the exercises and just step away from the table after that. But I know some of you love and relish a challenge, so here's my challenge to you. Can you create a little composition using some of the techniques that we've explored during this session and create a sort of response to this first cycle of the spring season? And that's it, folks. That's it for this week. I'll be back next week where we'll be looking at nests, and we'll be working with really similar colours for the next cycle, doing a bit of drawing, a little bit of painting, and as always, sort of drinking cups of tea and just really, really soaking up the beginning of this beautiful spring season together.